the smell of oil and salt in the air, believing themselves the masters of an unseen world. Every officer had memorized the rhythm of victory, merchant ships burning on the horizon, distant plumes of smoke rising like trophies. The Atlantic was their chessboard, and each sinking another silent move in a game they were certain they could not lose. Below deck, engines purred with mechanical pride. Crewmen trusted their steel hulls as though they were living things, beasts of the deep, loyal and unbreakable. Germany's naval command shared that conviction. Admirals toasted the ingenuity of Krupp and Germaniawerft, convinced that no enemy could reach beneath the surface to challenge them. The British fleet, vast and traditional, seemed lumbering in comparison, tied to the old doctrines of visible war gunfire, armor and flags. The Germans, by contrast, had evolved. They hunted without warning, without witness. To them, this was not cowardice, but precision, the cold elegance of modern war. When they spoke of danger, it was always theoretical. Submarine losses were rare, and the statistics felt like superstition. Each patrol reinforced their faith, surfacing at dawn after another night of stalking convoys. They saw the ocean as both ally and armor. Even the creaking of the hull under pressure was comforting, a reminder of the frontier they alone commanded. Beneath miles of indifferent water, they felt untouchable, gods in grey steel temples. Yet arrogance has a quiet hum, the same one that vibrated through the U-boat's narrow corridors. It was the sound of certainty, a sound too constant to question. And somewhere, far above the surface, other minds had begun listening to that hum, wondering how to turn the deep itself into a weapon. Convoy duty was never romantic. The sea that had once felt like the backbone of Britain, the shimmering lifeline to its empire, had turned into a vast, indifferent grave. Merchant ships, loaded with food, fuel, and letters from home, crept through grey swells in tight formations. They moved slowly, defensively, as if motion itself might draw fire. Beneath them, the ocean hid an enemy they could not see, only sense a whisper of metal, a fleeting shadow on sonar, a periscope flash swallowed by mist. Every wave might conceal a torpedo's trail. For the men aboard, each morning began with the same ritual of dread. They watched the horizon and listened for the sound that meant death, a muffled boom, a rush of flame, the sickening roll of a ship slipping into the cold. There was no warning, no mercy. The U-boats struck like ghosts, vanishing before the Royal Navy's destroyers could even triangulate their wake. Survivors from previous attacks spoke of the sea itself turning against them, of explosions that ripped steel apart like paper, of comrades flailing in oil-slick water before disappearing into silence. London knew the numbers. Hundreds of thousands of tons lost every month. Supplies dwindled, and Britain, once mistress of the waves, found herself gasping for breath. Newspapers softened the truth, but in harbors and shipyards, the fear was raw and open. Sailors clutched talismans, whispered prayers, and volunteered again despite knowing the odds. It wasn't courage that kept them sailing, it was necessity. The island would starve without them. The convoys carried more than cargo. They carried the fragile rhythm of a nation's heartbeat, and though the sailors didn't yet know it, every ship that vanished into the deep drew the world one step closer to a desperate kind of innovation, the moment when survival would depend not on bravery, but on invention. Beneath the grey Atlantic, the U-boat was not just a machine, it was a myth sealed in steel. Its crew moved like priests in a submerged cathedral, their every motion slow, deliberate, surrounded by the hum of engines and the faint drip of condensation. The world above was chaos, but here in the deep there was a strange peace, a belief that depth itself was protection. The sea muffled every sound, and that silence became sacred. They called it the Invisible Empire. German propaganda painted the U-boats as invincible hunters, creatures of darkness that no weapon could touch. Each dive reinforced the illusion. Pressure groaned against the hull, yet it held. Explosions echoed far away, fading harmlessly into the vastness. For a time, it felt like the ocean belonged to them alone, unchallenged, infinite, eternal. But myths have a way of hardening into blindness. Pride whispered louder than caution. Captains who had once feared the sea now treated it as a servant, certain it would always bear their weight. The crew laughed at the idea of defeat, their arrogance echoing through narrow metal corridors. They could not yet feel the tremor in history, the faint vibration of change that was already spreading through Allied laboratories and shipyards. For now, the U-boats sailed on, ghosts in their own legend. Yet in the quiet between missions, some swore the sea had begun to sound different, less like protection, more like a warning. The air inside a U-boat was always thick, not just with diesel fumes and sweat, but with the press of human closeness. Dozens of men lived elbow to elbow, breathing the same recycled air, the same breath that fogged the metal walls. When the hatch sealed, the world above ceased to exist. Time dissolved into the rhythm of shifts, the hum of the engines, the endless drip of condensation that ticked like a heartbeat through the hull. Each crewman had his place, his ritual. A mechanic wiped the same wrench 3 times before use. A radio operator whispered to the static like it might whisper back. Even laughter, sharp, brief, and echoing, was part of the rhythm. These men were hunters who could not see their prey. They listened instead, reading the sea's vibrations through fingertips and machinery. In the small galley, coffee brewed so thick it could mask the smell of oil, and meals were passed hand to hand, silent except for the scrape of tin on steel. Pride held them together. They were the chosen submariners, guardians of the unseen war. Above them, battleships made headlines. But down here, they lived as shadows, feared but unknown. Every successful patrol fed their myth, but each dive also demanded surrender to darkness, to pressure, to faith in the metal that enclosed them. When the engines slowed and the sea turned quiet, the men would listen to the creak of the hull, hearing the ocean's voice pressing close, a reminder that the deep they mastered could, at any moment, decide to claim them. On the surface, Britain seemed slow to change its navy, still ruled by tradition. Its admirals reluctant to admit that the enemy beneath the waves demanded a new kind of thinking. Yet necessity is the mother of innovation, and the Atlantic was bleeding ships faster than pride could permit. In back rooms along the coast, engineers, sailors, and scientists gathered not around maps but around microphones and blueprints. They began to listen to the ocean. Hydrophones came first, crude ears for the deep. Men leaned into static, learning to tell the difference between a whale's moan and a propeller's churn. Soon came the idea of organized protection convoys, ships moving not as lonely targets but as a single, beating heart. The hunters of the deep suddenly faced patterns they could not break as easily. Then, the weapon evolved. From small patrol boats to destroyers, depth charges were fitted steel drums filled with explosives, tuned to burst not on contact, but by pressure, calibrated to the very physics of the abyss. At first, even the crews doubted them. The sea swallowed sound and hid results. But then came oil slicks, rising slowly to the surface, shimmering proof that something below had died. The British learned that warfare could be as much about patience as precision, that silence could be a weapon too. Each improvement narrowed the ocean's secrecy. Sonar pulses began to probe the unseen. The U-boats, once ghosts, were becoming audible, traceable. The hunters had become the hunted, and somewhere in that shift, respect replaced arrogance. It was no longer a question of dominance, but survival for both sides. It happened on a quiet morning when the sea seemed almost kind. The convoy had passed through the night without incident, and the destroyers above were beginning their steady sweeps, listening, waiting. Then came a whisper through the hydrophones, a faint metallic rhythm pulsing through the water. Somewhere beneath them, a German U-boat moved like a shadow, confident as ever in its concealment. But this time, the British knew how to listen. Orders rippled across the deck. Engines throttled back. The destroyer slowed, its crew holding their breath as if afraid the ocean could hear them. The sound sharpened the beat of propellers, the soft hiss of compressed air. "Target fixed," came the murmur. Then the release. One after another, the depth charges rolled into the water, their metal casings spinning like coins tossed into a well. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the first detonation. The sea heaved as if something immense had exhaled beneath it. Below, in the U-boat, chaos reigned. Instruments shattered, lights flickered, and men screamed into the dark. The pressure crushed the hull like a fist tightening around bone. For the first time, a German submarine, the pride of the fleet, was caught, cornered, and destroyed by a weapon once dismissed as fantasy. When the oil and wreckage surfaced hours later, the men on deck said nothing. They stared at the dark stains spreading across the waves, the fragments of what had once been invincible. Pride and horror mingled in their eyes. Somewhere between triumph and pity, they realized the war beneath the waves had changed forever. Inside the U-boat, every sense sharpened into torment. The air hung thick with oil, sweat, and the tang of metal. Every man knew the pattern now, the rhythmic hum of their own engines, the subtle lilt of the ocean currents. But when the sound of the destroyer's screws passed overhead, that rhythm turned to dread. The men froze. Even breathing became a crime against survival. The captain whispered orders that felt more like prayers: hold depth, no movement. The boat became a tomb of restraint. Then came the worst part: silence. In that suffocating stillness, the mind filled in what the ears could not. Somewhere above, men were listening, calculating. Somewhere beyond the hull, death floated, waiting for a reason to drop. The sonar pings began again, sharp, metallic knocks that struck the nerves like hammer blows. Each one echoed through the steel and into bone. Every man flinched, eyes darting toward the ceiling as if he could see the surface through layers of iron and fear. The first explosion came like a heartbeat breaking. The lights flickered, dust rained from the seams. Another charge followed closer this time. Pipes hissed. A valve screamed, and water began to trickle in thin, mocking lines. Someone muttered a prayer. Another cursed the sea itself. The soundscape of survival was chaos wrapped in silence, the tension between the deafening roar of the depth charges and the unbearable pause that followed. And when the attack finally ceased, there was no relief, only the echo of what might return. The men exhaled quietly, trembling, alive but hollow. In that darkness, they understood that the enemy above was not just the destroyer, but the ocean itself, its vast, indifferent patience pressing in from every side. When the boat finally surfaced, the survivors emerged into a world that no longer looked familiar. The sea was calm again, deceptively peaceful, as if it had forgotten the violence it had just witnessed. Oil clung to their skin, their faces were grey with exhaustion and disbelief. The air felt too light after hours of compressed fear. Some stared into the horizon in silence, others murmured names that would never answer back. The ocean that had once been their ally now felt vast and merciless, a grave without markers. The German command received the news with shock, cloaked in denial. U-boats had been symbols of dominance, instruments of terror whispered across continents. Now, for the first time, one had been hunted, cornered, destroyed. In the officers' clubs, men spoke of it in hushed tones, glancing at each other as if acknowledging a forbidden truth. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and through that fracture, doubt began to seep, quiet, corrosive, unstoppable. Even for the British, triumph was tempered by unease. They had proven that technology could conquer the unseen, but in doing so had crossed into a darker, more uncertain future. The sea was no longer a mystery, it was a battlefield without boundaries. As night fell over the Atlantic, the waves rolled on indifferently, washing away oil and memory alike. Those who survived understood something their superiors did not. Beneath all the pride and strategy, the ocean belonged to no one. It took what it wished, and in its silence it kept the truth that no machine, no man, could ever truly master the deep. In the quiet rooms of British naval laboratories, the war took on a different rhythm. Not the pounding of guns, but the steady hum of machines, the scratching of pencils across blueprints, the drip of condensation from a kettle left forgotten. Here, victory would be measured not in miles of territory, but in decimals, diagrams, and equations. Men in rolled-up sleeves leaned over tables where glass tubes and copper wires sprawled like veins, the anatomy of a new kind of warfare. The hydrophone came first, a simple ear pressed against the dark. It turned the ocean into a stage of whispers, capturing the faint murmur of propellers miles away. Operators learned to distinguish patterns, the stutter of a merchant ship, the steady heartbeat of a submarine. It was patient work, demanding focus and silence, a mirror of the very hunt it served. Yet in that stillness, science began to hear what arrogance never could: the subtle presence of the unseen. Then came the timing fuses. Precision became poetry. Engineers worked through nights, adjusting seconds and springs until destruction could be tuned like music. The goal was not just to drop explosives, but to predict where fear itself would hide to meet the enemy in the one place he thought he was safe. Each new invention carried a quiet pride, but also a weight. These weren't weapons of passion, they were instruments of intellect, cold, exact, and strangely beautiful. The men behind them rarely saw the ocean, but their minds reached farther than any periscope. In the long corridors of the Admiralty, a sense of inevitability began to form, the realization that this war, once ruled by courage and instinct, now belonged to mathematics and machines. And with that realization came the faint unease that progress always brings. They were not soldiers, yet they fought their own kind of war, one of ethics, calculation, and sleepless nights. The engineers behind the new anti-submarine weapons lived in a strange duality. They were makers of death who longed for peace. In the dim light of laboratories smelling of oil and ozone, men debated equations and morality in the same breath. A successful design meant lives saved, but also lives taken. And that contradiction pressed against them like the hum of their own machines. Some were driven purely by necessity. The sea had become a predator, and they were tasked with taming it. They spoke of resonance, range, and detonation curves, language that made destruction sound civilized. But in quiet moments, when a fuse worked perfectly or a new device sank unseen into the depths, there was a silence none of them celebrated. They imagined the echo of their success reaching human ears below, and it haunted them. Others, though, saw their work as progress, the triumph of reason over chaos. "We build to end the killing faster," one wrote in his notebook, the words blotted by spilled ink. For them, invention was salvation, not sin. Yet even they could not ignore the invisible line between genius and guilt. At sea, their devices were tested in offices, their conscience was tested more. And when reports came in U-boat destroyed, no survivors, each engineer felt both pride and unease. It was victory, yes, but one born of intellect turned inward against itself. Science had found its target, and in doing so, discovered its conscience. The war beneath the surface was no longer just mechanical, it had become moral. The ocean never took sides. Beneath the surface, where light faded and sound stretched into eternity, the same pressure that crushed steel also held it together. Both hunter and hunted moved through this silent cathedral of currents, each fearing the other and both ruled by forces far older than war. Every explosion, every sonar pulse, was answered by the same timeless rhythm of waves against hulls, a reminder that humanity's struggle was brief against the vast indifference of the sea. For all its machines and mathematics, mankind could not claim mastery here. The Atlantic was an equalizer, erasing distinction between courage and fear, between invention and desperation. U-boats and destroyers became fragile shadows drifting through a realm that answered only to depth and silence. Victories dissolved as quickly as oil on water, their echoes swallowed by the same darkness that had nurtured them. Even the engineers, staring at charts and signals, began to understand the irony. Their brilliance existed only at the mercy of an element that could crush it in a heartbeat. The sea had watched empires rise and fall. It would outlast this one too. As dawn broke over a calm horizon, ships moved carefully, humbled by the quiet. The balance of terror had not ended, it had simply evolved. Above and below, life continued, but now with reverence. The ocean had taught both sides its eternal truth. In the end, the deep remembers everything and forgives nothing. They rest now in the archives, words scrawled in pencil, written by hands that would never surface again. Letters and logbooks salvaged from wrecks, pressed flat by time and pressure, tell of men who lived and died beneath the waves. Their handwriting trembles between precision and fatigue, ink bleeding into paper like salt through cloth. "The sea is quiet tonight," one captain wrote, unaware that it would be his last entry. Another noted engine trouble, then the temperature of the water, as if routine could hold back fate. Between coordinates and technical notes, there are fragments of humanity, a line about a wife's birthday, a complaint about stale bread, a joke that ends mid-sentence. Each page breathes the rhythm of confinement. The U-boat crews were both explorers and prisoners, sealed inside steel cylinders with their fears. In one recovered log, the officer of the watch wrote about listening to the creaks of the hull, how the sound became a heartbeat when the ocean pressed close. Another sailor confessed that the silence between attacks was worse than the bombs themselves. He feared his own thoughts more than the enemy. When divers found the remains decades later, the vessels were like time capsules, their instruments still pointed toward oblivion. Personal items lay scattered, a pipe, a compass, a rusted wristwatch stopped at 2:17 a.m. These relics spoke more than medals ever could. They were reminders that even the most confident hunters had known fragility. The letters that survived censorship and distance carried the same tone, calm, dutiful, almost tender. "Tell the children I am safe," one man wrote, days before his U-boat vanished. The ocean kept its reply. In those pages, you can hear not just the war, but the echo of something older, humanity whispering to itself in the dark, hoping the deep might listen. When the war finally began to quiet, the inventions did not. The world had learned too much to unlearn. Laboratories that once trembled with urgency now hummed with reflection. The men who had perfected the hydrophone, the fuse, and the bomb began to ask what it meant to be brilliant in service of destruction. The moral cost lingered not in what they built, but in what they proved, that reason itself could be weaponized. Progress, once celebrated, now carried the aftertaste of guilt. They had conquered the invisible, mapped the unseeable, and harnessed sound as a blade. But each success stripped a layer of innocence from science. Equations that once spoke of possibility now whispered of loss. The war had turned thinkers into tacticians, dreamers into destroyers. They could not claim ignorance of consequence. Their precision left no room for it, and though they had helped shorten the war, they also deepened the shadows it cast on the human soul. Some defended their work with pragmatism, if not us, someone else. Others withdrew into silence, their names erased beneath medals and bureaucracy. But history would remember them as the architects of both safety and sorrow. The tools they forged would evolve, shaping new wars, new fears, new forms of mastery without mercy. As years passed, one truth endured: every advance demanded a toll unseen in its moment. The ocean, the machines, and the minds that served them had all been changed. The moral question left behind was simple and terrible: had humanity gained control of the deep, or had it surrendered something deeper to achieve it? In the quiet aftermath, the water lay still again, reflecting nothing but the weight of its memory. Long after the engines rusted and the crews vanished, the sea remained vast, patient, unjudging. It had watched the arrogance of men come and go, had carried their machines on its back and buried them in its depths. Every wreck became part of its memory, softened by coral, embraced by silence. The ocean did not celebrate victory nor mourn defeat. It simply endured, reshaping the scars left by war into something wordless and eternal. In the dim light filtering through the water, life returned. Fish darted through shattered hulls, anemones bloomed on twisted steel. The U-boats, once symbols of pride and fear, now lay like cathedrals reclaimed by time. What had been instruments of death became sanctuaries of life. The deep had forgiven, if not forgotten. Above, the waves whispered against the shore as they had for centuries, indifferent to who ruled the world above them. Storms came and passed, tides rose and fell, and humanity, restless, inventive, and flawed, looked out once more toward the horizon, never learning, never stopping. The ocean needed no monument. Its vastness was memory enough. Beneath its surface, history rested quietly, stripped of flags and names. And in that stillness, something sacred remained: the final truth that nature does not avenge or absolve, it outlasts. As the sun sank into the waves, the last echoes of war dissolved into the deep, leaving only the sound of water breathing, ancient, endless, and free.